Hello, good day. Welcome to the Peat Exchange series. Today I'm going to try to shift my slides. Slide shifter isn't working. Just a moment, please. No, not working. Bear with us for a moment, please. Yes. So today we are in the second Peat Exchange series, and it's all in the light of the artist in residency of Kate Foster to the World Soil Museum. And the World Soil Museum collaborates with artists on the broader topic of soils to create awareness, facilitate dialogue, learning and exchange, and stimulate engagement, curiosity, wonder, exploration, and most of all, enjoyment. And Kate Foster is the artist this year that is connected to the World Soil Museum, and she's also connected to various projects all on the topic of peat. And the residency includes, amongst other, this series, the second of four, an exhibit in the World Soil Museum, and other engagement and dialogue events. And you see here on the icons of on the screen what other organizations, projects are involved, like Wet Futures, Home Turf, and Drents Museum. Here you have an image of Kate, who will come in focus later in this series, standing in a peat bog with a nice statement. And peatlands are fascinating landscapes. They tell a lot of stories, environmental, from the pedology part, so the formation and the properties from soil science perspective, ecology, they're special in terms of hydrology, culture, history, and archaeology. And if we look into peat domes and peat soils, there are many things to discover from all these different aspects. So the question is, what can we learn from peat and learn from things that we find in the peat and the narratives that we develop on them. So today we'll have an interesting program. We'll talk about the topic of today is labeled Archaeological Tales from the Bog. So stories from the bog, and there are very interesting stories that we're going to hear today, and explanations, and hopefully also a fruitful discussion. Now, last time in the introduction, I showed you a profile, a peat profile from a peat dike from the Wilnis area in the central part of the Netherlands that contained a lot of artifacts like the clay pipes that you see here. But this time, before I shift to Roy van Beek, because Roy van Beek, I will introduce you another artifact in the museum, but this is let me introduce you first the program. We, after my introduction, we have a wonderful presentation by Dr. Roy van Beek on the past, present, and future of Dutch bogs from an archaeological perspective. Then we take a 5-minute break, and after that, we'll have a presentation from the Drents Museum Curator of Archeology for Huisman, who will talk about bog treasures at the Drents Museum in Assen. After that, Kate will present, and her presentation is called Imagining Lives Lived Above and Below Ground. And after that, we'll have a group discussion. Now, I'm going to shift camera and position and take you to one of the artifacts that we have in the museum that came ultimately from a peatland. And I'm walking to that other camera now. Bear with me for a moment, please. So now we'll change camera position. Yes. Can you hear me, Emily? Okay, good. So I'm walking past these profiles, which are mostly mineral profiles, but I'm walking towards the other edge of the museum, where we have an object that was excavated from a mining area in Limburg, which is a big tree trunk. And I remember that very well when I was a student in the soil science and geography department of the Wageningen University, which is now called soil and geography. Well, sorry, I can't remember the proper name now, but at the time, as a student, when I walked to my tutor and lectures, I always touched this tree trunk knowing that it was an object from the far past. And it was excavated from a mine in Limburg, and it's just plain wood, but it's 6 million years old, or more or less. And so it's an attestant of a period long time ago. And yeah, it's lignite, so it's from a brown coal mine, so which was originally peat, but later turned into brown coal. And in that brown coal, this tree trunk was conserved as an observer of times much before ours. And I found it always fascinating to find an object, yeah, that once lived in a landscape similar to those that we can see now, but it tells a story. And today we are going to get stories from our presenters, and we also use our imagination to think of the past and the information that we can get from that. So now I'm giving the floor to Roy van Beek, who will present to you. Yes.
So, Van, does it work? Do we have sound already? Yeah. Well, thank you, Stephan, for a nice introduction. Let's see if this one works. Yeah. Okay. So, also welcome on behalf of me in this second Peatland Exchange in the very nice World Soil Museum. I'm Roy van Beek. I'm an archaeologist. I work here at this beautiful university at two different groups, the Cultural Geography group and the Soil Geography and Landscape group. And I'm also the project leader of the Home Turf project, in which we have focused. Is my sound now working? Yeah?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, my apologies. We have some slight technical hiccups, but I think it's almost something that we are getting used to after 2 years of lockdown. And let's hope we are getting out of that quite quickly. So I'll just repeat what I just said to be so that you're up to date. So I'm Roy van Beek. I'm a landscape archaeologist. I work here at Wageningen University. And I'm also the project leader of the Home Turf project, which started in 2016 and is now in its final year, unfortunately. But on the other hand, this also means that we can show you some of the very nice results that we have obtained in that interdisciplinary project. Now, maybe some of you have already seen the first Peatland Exchange, in which we talked about the genesis and the stratigraphy and the formation of peat. And in the second Peatland Exchange, we are mainly going to talk about archaeology. And in my respect, it's mainly going to be about landscape archaeology, because that is my own expertise and where I can, I think, tell a nice story to you today. So let's see if the slides work. There we go. So what I want to do with you today is focus on 3 different components. So first, I'm going to try and give you a little bit of the Dutch context. I think if you compare the Netherlands with other parts of Europe, then it's got some quite particular characteristics, which are different from, for example, the United Kingdom or Ireland or Scandinavia. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about, not just about the physical geography, but also about the past of archaeology. So the research history, more or less, very short because of time limits. Then I'm going to tell you about how to contextualize archaeological peatland finds. I have to explain that a little bit. In the Netherlands, we have got quite spectacular archaeological finds from bogs. And you will see some of those in the second part of this session. But most of these finds, I think I could almost say all of these finds have been done in the distant past. And with distant past, I actually mean before the 1960s. So in 1957, we still had the discovery of the famous Baga Oosterveld temple, but that was one of the last discoveries that we had. So these finds from bogs are spectacular. They have qualities which enable us to say something about life lived in the past and about past landscapes, but they do have some limitations regarding data quality. So this is something to take into account, and I'm going to try and show you the potential of such finds by means of a case study of the famous bog body of Idegirl. I think the most iconic find that we have in Dutch peatland archaeology. And then thirdly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the reconstruction of long-term human landscape interactions. So as you will see, large parts of the Netherlands have been once covered with bogs, and that's a process that was really influential, and it's not just from a landscape perspective, but also with regard to what people could do in these landscapes over time. And I'm especially interested in those interactions, so human landscape interactions, for which we need data on all kinds of landscape processes. So that's the third component that I'm going to talk about. And this is focused on the Vochtelo Veen region. That's a region which we have done quite a lot of research in, also by Cindy Quick, who spoke to you, or some of you who were there in the first session. So let's then move to that Dutch setting. Well, I'm starting here with some quite well-known paleogeographical maps. People who are acquainted with Dutch landscape history will already more or less know them by heart. But for an international audience, I think they're still very informative. And what you see here are a series of maps that are made by Peter Vos and his colleagues. They show specific time slices in the history of the Dutch landscape. And here, obviously, as you can already see by the key, you have to mainly look at these brownish colors. So these are the peat soils. And what you can see almost immediately is that in the course of the Holocene, large parts of the Dutch landscape have become covered with these brown peatland soils. There's no distinction here between fens and bogs. It's actually quite difficult to make that distinction. But this shows how dominant that landscape type has been in the past. In the past, I say, because if you look at the modern day landscape, then it's very striking to see that only a very tiny proportion of those former peatlands that were so dominant have survived until the present day. So you can imagine that only 5%, that's an estimate, of those peatland soils have survived. And obviously it's got to do with different types of reclamations that happened here in the past. So you can make a really general distinction between agrarian reclamations and reclamations for turf exploitation. I will not go into detail here on that, but maybe Maurice Paulus will say something about that in the third session of the Peatland Exchanges, which will happen in 2 weeks' time. I do want to show you quickly here to the right, a quite famous image that was made, or at least in Dutch context, an image that was made by Karel Leenders, a landscape historian. And he showed in this simple image that the reclamations of Dutch bogs actually started in the northern part of Belgium, the Flanders region, and then that actually moved, the technique moved to the southern parts of the Netherlands, and then it went all the way up and then down again in the 19th century to the Pale region, which is one of the last large bogs that we had, and that was also being reclaimed by them. So that's actually the reason behind those large-scale reclamations, and the fact that we as archaeologists and landscape historians only have these very tiny areas left to study. And therefore we have to deal with landscapes like this. So this is the famous Bourtanger Moor, I think I can say. I think archaeologists will know this term very well, or this area very well. The Bourtanger Moor was once, if I'm correct, and if I have to believe Wil Caspari, one of the peatland ecologists that we have here, the largest bog that once existed north of the Alps. So it was huge and it contained all kinds of spectacular archaeological finds. We will see some of those in the presentation by Floor. But nowadays the landscape looks like this. So a typical peat colonial landscape, no bogs are left anymore, just straight lines and meadows. So obviously that hinders modern day research into the past of these landscapes. Let's move then to the archaeology and the research history in that respect. I think I already mentioned that we mainly have to deal with chance finds during peat cutting. so already before the 1960s. The main focus of Dutch peatland archaeology has always been on the northeastern Netherlands, which may have been the area that was most rich in bog. And I should also stress, I think, that formal research programs are quite rare or have been quite rare in the past. I already mentioned Wilco Spari. He actually was not an archaeologist, but a peatland ecologist. But he was really interested in peatland archaeology as well. And he, amongst others, has been very active in the investigation of trackways. And most of those are situated in the Bourtangermoor. But he was also working in Ireland, for example. So some of the international audience here may have known Will in the past. And then I also have to give some credit to the Drents Museum, of course. Now, Floor is currently working at the Drents Museum as a conservator. And she is one of the researchers in a longer line. And I think most of the archaeologists here will know the name of Wijnand van der Zanden, who was an expert, or is an expert still, I should say, now retired on bog bodies and has done great work on those. But also Vincent van Vilstra, for example, who is an expert more in medieval times and studied medieval finds that were coming from the bogs and also post-medieval finds. And finally, I should also stress, not unimportantly, that hardly any work has been done since 2000 or so. And so peatland archaeology more or less stood still for a while until in 2016, we started the Home Turf project. So we more or less tried to revive peatland archaeology in the Netherlands. Now, I think before I start with that first case study that I want to show you, I would also like to point out some major archaeological research deficits, which I think are important. Well, the first one has already been discussed, so we have to deal with old finds, and the data resolution in that respect is relatively low. We are dealing with reclaimed landscapes, and that means that fieldwork options, for example, trying to reconstruct the original context of those finds is quite limited, or are quite limited. And something that I haven't told yet is that we also have to deal with these separate research traditions traditionally. So what has happened in the Netherlands is that we, on the one hand, had wetland specialists, people working on peatland archaeology, but also on vegetation history, for example. And we had dryland specialists, just archaeologists doing settlement archaeology on the drier sandy soils. And actually, those two lines of investigation have not been combined properly yet. And that's something that's not typically Dutch. It's something that's also known from the United Kingdom, for example, in this beautiful publication by Robert van der Noort and Aidan O'Sullivan. It's also mentioned, and after that, it's also repeated. So I think archaeologists are aware of the problem and they are trying to solve it, but still it is something that we have to deal with and it is not completely solved yet. So that's also something that was important in the Home Turf project. So basically, we could say that we are missing the full context to tell the full narrative on these peatland finds, and that's something that we try to address in the Home Turf project. Let's then start with that first case study that I wanted to show you, and that's the famous bog body of Idergul. Now, basically, we have these spectacular finds, and then the question is, how do we come from that top picture, like the Valterbrug, which is a famous hurdle trackway that was excavated already in the 19th century, I think, maybe early 20th century. I have to provide you correct information. How do we get from that archaeological excavation to that image that was made by Ilko Glimmerveen, which actually shows quite beautifully how you can contextualize such a peat trackway. Now, I do not think I tell real landscape archaeological experts anything new, that interdisciplinary research is really key in trying to reconstruct those contexts. So you have to combine archaeology, physical geography, paleobotany, all kinds of specialistic analysis, obviously. But in some cases, you can also use historical data if you have to deal with, if you are dealing with younger finds. Now, I'm going to show you briefly the case study of Idergul, which we worked on in 2018 and 2019. So here's Idergul. I think Dutch people will know them, but I think she's also famous in the European perspective. And that's got to do with the fact that this bog body, her face was reconstructed in Manchester in the early 1990s. We can see her face there to the right with Wijnand van der Zanden, the famous bog body specialist from the Drents Museum and the province of Drenthe. So that girl was very young when she was killed. It is quite clear that she was killed because she had a cord around her neck. She may also have had a stab wound in her chest. We are not really sure about that still. It has been a matter of debate for a longer time. And she lived some 2,000 years ago. She was found in 1897, as you can see, and that happened during peat dredging. So people were extracting peat on a relatively low scale, so not industrial scale. And that's when the body turned up. Now, I think this really shows one of the main problems of Dutch peatland archaeology. This is the find spot today. So there's no bog to be seen. We just see that reclaimed landscape. There's even a ditch completely through the site. So yeah, that original context is quite difficult to reconstruct, but we gave it a try. And you can see here to the right, the find spot indicated with that blue arrow. There are still some crops standing there. I think there are beetroots or something. And that's the case because the spot is still very wet. So we spoke to the farmer, and the farmer said, well, it's actually this wet here that we cannot even get these crops out. And therefore he said, no, next year we're not even gonna try anymore. We're just gonna leave it be. So there's still, yeah, some idea of that the spot was really wet. So what did we do? We made a combination of different methodologies, and we also looked at different research skills. Maybe I should explain that first. So we want to know what the character of the find spot itself looked like. So we investigated that spot that you just saw. But we also wanted to place the living world of Idegul some 2,000 years ago in a wider perspective. So therefore we made an inventory of both archaeological evidence for that wider area, but also existing pollen studies, palynological research, geomorphological data. So we also combined those types of data to be able to create the living world of Idegul, or recreate, I should say. So some results of that. Here we can see a map of the geomorphology of the wider region, with that white star indicating the spot where she was found. It's quite in your face, this image, I think. But what you should get from this is that it's a quite diverse landscape, and it's dominated by moraine ridges, which are indicated in red here. So more or less northeast, northwest, southeast oriented. To the northeast, you can even see that purplish color, which is a remainder of the former Boetangermoor. So that's the top corner, top right. The Boetangermoor was far larger. It stretches kilometers further. And then you have a number of stream valleys and small fens that are dispersed over this area. So quite heterogeneous landscape. So where was she then found? Well, we were actually a little bit surprised. It wasn't completely new. It had already been mentioned in previous literature, but that Idegul was not found in an enormous, pristine swamp, which was not touched by people, but she was actually deposited or left in a very small depression. So you can see it here. It's only 20 or 30 meters in diameter, only 2 meters deep, and it must have been, swampy depression, and also in an area which was not far away from a variety of sediments and other indications for human use of the landscape. So you can see a very simple compilation map of archaeological sites that I made in this area. You can see here some sites which we are certain of that there are settlements. There were small hamlets just consisting of 2 or 3 farmsteads at the same time. We also have areas where stray finds were done. Those are indicated by black farmsteads, and I think those originally also came from habitation spots. We have all kinds of arable field systems in the vicinity. So in short, it's a cultural landscape. So people modified this landscape, they lived in it, and within that settled, cultivated landscape, they found a spot in which they deposited Idegul, for which the general idea is that she was killed for votive deposits, for ritual connotations. That's a whole other discussion which I will not go into, but I'm sure there are some people here in the audience who have ideas about that. And here, just to show, make the picture complete, is a map of the vegetation of the area. You can also see here that's a quite diverse landscape. So top right, it's now becoming more clear that you have to deal with that vast Bourtanger Moor. So that's a few kilometers away. I should say again that that black star in the middle indicates the find spot of Idegul. I'm not sure if that's clear at all, but there's a 1 beside it. You can see the purple spots, which are smaller fens. So that's indeed one of the that's indeed the find location of Idegul as well. And then you have different forest types, but also more cultural areas like heathlands, areas that we use for agriculture. We have some spots where probably open water was. So it's actually a quite diverse landscape. So here are some of the main conclusions of that case study. And if you want to know more, you have to read that research paper here to the bottom, which is published in the Holocene. I'll put the link in the chat later. So the conclusion is that she was found in a small and shallow swamp, quite close to the world of the living. The habitation at this time consisted of dispersed farms and hamlets, so we don't have any larger clusters of habitation, no hill forts, oppida, things like that. It's very egalitarian, which I've put also on the bottom. And it's a very man-made landscape. It was half open, heavily influenced by humans. So I think this shows that you can, by reconstructing and sometimes even using existing data or compiling existing data, you can get a fuller image of the original context of the landscape in which such spectacular finds, which in the past have often been used just to study in themselves or from a typological perspective, can become, you can bring those contexts more to life. And that's also something that we're going to address in the second part of the Peatland Exchange with Floor Huisman. I think I should move to the third part, time-wise. Okay, I've got some time left still, I hear from Emily, which deals with long-term human landscape interactions. So you have to see that case study of Idegul as a reconstruction, a quite detailed recent reconstruction, I think, of one time slice in the history of a landscape in which human activity was contextualized. Now, what I'm also interested in is how landscapes change over time. So you need to have that factor time involved as well. And in this case, the Northern Netherlands provide a very interesting case study because I showed you when I started this presentation, the expansion, the gradual expansion of those bogs over, especially the lower sandy soils that we have in the Northern Netherlands. So I'm mainly interested in the intersection of different landscape processes here. And this involves peat inception and expansion. Well, that's something that Cindy Quick 2 weeks ago also talked about. I'm especially interested in the lateral expansion of bogs. So how fast did they grow? When did they grow? What did that mean for human habitation? I'm also interested in human land use trends. So what did people do? Which sites did they choose to settle? How did they interact with those growing bogs and things like that? And then both of these aspects also have got to do with vegetation dynamics. And if you then combine those and get to grips with these different processes and their paces and the places in which this happens, then you can make a quite detailed reconstruction of peatland dynamics, more or less. Now, we're not the first people who tried this. Obviously, I have to point to one of my professors actually in Leiden University, Harry Fokkens. He wrote a PhD thesis on the gradual drowning of the northeastern Netherlands, I should say, the Frisian Drents plateau. So that's already a very nice publication to start with, but he looked at a very large area and mainly used existing data, I think, in the inventory those. Now, what we did was zoom in on a smaller case study area, which still was quite significant in size, and that's the Vochteloer Veen the work area of Cindy Quick as well, in which we really tried to collect high resolution data on a variety of proxies. Now, here you can see all kinds of different analysis that we did and different methods that we applied. So we did extensive geological coring throughout that Vochtelo vein area with Cindy, but also with students of Wageningen. There we tried to date the oldest peat layers that we have, because that tells something about when peat started to grow and how fast it grew. So you can use those old dates of the initial peat layers to model that peat expansion. That's something that we are still working on currently. So I can show you some results of that, but not too much. We did paleoecological research on those cores that we took, both for pollen, so fossil pollen, but also macro remains that were inside of those. And besides that, we made an archaeological inventory of the wider area around the Vochtelo vein. And what I was also quite excited about was that we managed to have Ilko Glimmerveen, who is a quite famous archaeological illustrator in the Netherlands, make evidence-based reconstructions of what the landscape looked like in two different time slices, which were important in the landscape history of the Vochtelo vein. So I'm going to take you quickly through some of the most interesting results. Here we can see an image, a very simple image of the Vochtelo vein. So you can see here in the middle, in the purple color, you can see the area where still peat is present. Around that, you can see some grayish colors, which we know that peat was originally present, but was reclaimed. This happened here in the 16th and the 17th, from the 16th and the 17th century onwards. And then beyond that, we can see those yellowish colors, which are higher sandy soils, which are ideal for habitation. And then also this area was dissected by dark green valleys, so water courses which ran through it. This is also the first time slice of the archaeological inventory, and what you can see here immediately is that the area was frequented and used very intensively by hunter-gatherer groups. So small campsites were quite abundant here for periods of thousands of years. And we even have in one of the valleys in the west, the famous Tjonger Valley, we have a well-preserved dump of bone material, which also indicates that which dates to the late Mesolithic, which indicates that sometimes the preservation conditions can be quite ideal in those settings still. Well, actually, I'm quite proud of this reconstruction. This is a reconstruction by Ilko Glimmerveen, which was based on actual elevation data in combination with archaeological data and vegetation data. So this is not just an image, it is really evidence-based, and we thought almost about every tree, whether it was in the right spot. And I think it was a quite nice exercise to be able to think about the quality of those reconstructions, and which also pinpoints very clearly what you don't know. So we can see here in the foreground, you can see a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer camp. To the left, you can see some deer which were hunted at this phase. So I think it brings the landscape alive. And I think many people will be surprised that in this early Holocene, the landscape was still very densely wooded. So after the late glacial, vegetation started growing again, and then you got these very dense forests. So I'm going to take you through some time slices a bit more quickly for reasons of time. This is the area when we have the first farming communities. So you can see here that in the Neolithic and the early Bronze Age, you have settlements, especially on the higher sandy soils, but also on some sandy ridges in that peat area in the central part. So that apparently was still accessible. We also have evidence for some votive depositions on some locations. For example, stone axes, we have flint daggers and things like that. Then we move on to the Middle Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Here we can see in the archaeology some of the first indications that the landscape is becoming more and more wet. For example, in the southern part, you can see those two wooden platforms, and those are actually parts of wooden trackways that were found in the vicinity of Smilde. So they indicate that the area was getting wetter. And this one, perhaps most interestingly, is the Roman period in which you can see that large parts of this area have been abandoned. And I've taken this, and we as a research team have taken this as an indication that the area at this point was extremely wet. So we think that the bog had extended over quite large areas of time. But there's one exception, or a few exceptions, to the northeast. I'm sorry, you can still see some of those farmsteads. Those are areas which were relatively high and dry, so people could still remain living there for longer periods of time. And there's one spot, more or less in the central part of this image, where you can see one white farmstead, and that's the famous drowning settlement of Vochtelo. This is a settlement that was excavated by the famous Professor Albert Egges van Giffen, together with a local amateur archaeologist called Popping. And they found a number of house plants, which you can see here. And what especially was striking was that you had these large white ditches around them, and they contained quite dense packages of iron ore. And Van Giffen then said, well, this is because the ridge that we are dealing with was becoming wetter and wetter over time, and at some point people just had to leave this location. And indeed, we don't have much evidence for habitation after the Roman period. It only comes back in the late Middle Ages. So this indeed seems to point out that the landscape was gradually drowning. And here we can see another beautiful illustration by Ilko Glimmerveen, where you see a reconstruction of that farmstead or that settlement of Vochtelo in the foreground. And in the back, you can see already quite substantial bogs that had developed over time. You can still see those trees standing in the middle of the bog. Those are relatively higher ridges, which may have stayed open or not covered with peat until in the course of the Roman period. Now here are a few images to show that process of peat inception. So this is something that we are still working on. So we're trying to model it. It's actually not as easy as you may think, but it is a very interesting exercise to try and model that. So here you can see the dates that we so far had of the base layers of the peat profiles. And in different colors, you can see the different dates. So what is immediately clear is that it's not something that happened in one specific period, but there's a larger time depth in it. So it's a process that took longer periods of time and may also have been spatially different. I want to point you to finish this story to the Bonghaar Ridge, which is one of the higher sandy ridges, which was sitting inside of the larger bog. And that dark line that you see here, that's a profile that we made over that Bonghaar Ridge. You can see it here. It was inhabited in Mesolithic times, so flint material was found on top of it, which indicates that there were camps there. And we can see here in the Neolithic, the first organic matter or first semi-peat layers start developing here in the west. This also happens on the other side of the ridge in the Bronze Age. So you can see the peat growing. And here we can see a stratigraphy of the present day. We don't have any dates from the Iron Age and Roman period, but we think that that is the phase in which that ridge was completely covered or almost completely covered with peat. So I've got 2 more slides to conclude, if that's okay. This is the some preliminary conclusions for Vochtelo, so we're still working on it. But what we really clearly see is that we are dealing with a gradually drowning landscape, which was first more or less a hunter-gatherer Walhalla. It offered all kinds of opportunities for these hunter-gatherer groups to people who were struggling with the expanding peat. What we also see from archaeological evidence, but also in the vegetation trends that we have, is that human impact increased from the Middle Neolithic onwards and then became larger until people left the area. And we're still working on how to model peatland expansion, but also how to disentangle specific landscape processes. For example, the landscape becoming more open. Has that got to do with people cutting trees for agriculture, or has it got to do with the increasingly wetter character of the landscape? Well, some general conclusions then to close off with. What I hope to have shown you today is that new research on old archaeological finds like Ida can still be extremely valuable and indeed help us tell those narratives of past peatland environments and people in the past. We need to integrate the existing small peat remnants that we still have with the reclaimed landscapes that used to be peat and the neighboring drylands to be able to sketch a full picture. And to do that, interdisciplinary research is really essential. So one of the final things that we still want to do in the last half year or so of the Home Turf project is to focus a bit more on heritage management and also on how the archaeological heritage which is present in those bogs is actually affected by or how it relates to things like nature conservation. So that's something that is still in the pipeline, and hopefully also something that Maurice Paulsen will talk about in the next Peatland Exchange in 2 weeks' time. So thank you for your attention, and welcome to any questions or put them in the chat.
Thank you very much, Roy. That was very interesting and very inspiring to see this landscape evolution and different periods of time and how people lived in those landscapes. I already have a question that was sent. Can you say a bit more about prehistoric communities living in more varied landscapes? Was this also an advantage possibly, for instance, because of diversity of local resources, as well as different kinds of place for spiritual meaning, perhaps?
Yeah, it's I think diverse landscapes have all kinds of things going for them. Also, for example, if you look at early prehistory, so hunter-gatherer communities often prefer diverse landscapes because they have a very high biodiversity. So especially, I think biodiversity is highest on places where you have transitions between different landscape trends, like borders. So I think those diverse landscapes are indeed ideal then. And yeah, if you look back, go further in later prehistoric times, then people also will always have certain needs to be able to live. So they would have to have a sufficient area of arable, for example. Sometimes heathland, you need to herd their sheep, you need a little bit of water. So you need a combination of different landscape types. So I guess indeed that diverse landscapes are not bad at all. They're actually quite interesting. But in the case of Vochtlau, you can see that people stick to that area for a long period of time, but then and suddenly some kind of threshold, I think, is crossed in which the landscape becomes too wet, and then they just decide we're going to move away. Yeah.
So can you say that the Roman agriculturists were in a marginal landscape for agriculture?
I think they were. Yeah. I think maybe the Neolithic farming communities were in pretty ideal circumstances, and then it got wetter and wetter. And I would say indeed that in that period, then I would call it marginal. Yeah, that's a good term, I think.
Question from the audience.
Yes, I see here the question from Ingrid Livers.
Yellow raised his hand.
Okay, Yellow, please.
I did. I became big all of a sudden. At least my video. Video one. Hi, Roy.
Hey.
Your landscape reconstruction study of the Idergul, it's really interesting and it's fascinating, and we talked about it before. We're in the same group, here at Wageningen University, so I know Roy well. I was wondering, so you gave us a nice overview of the landscape setting of the Idergul, and then how to interpret her social and physical landscape. I was wondering, what do you know about other bog bodies? Are there comparable settings for other bog bodies from Northern Europe or Northwestern Europe?
That's a very good question. We actually recently finished a large research into the dating and the landscape setting of a European bog bodies, which is submitted somewhere to a journal. So I cannot tell much about it yet. But what's really striking is that there's a wide diversity in bog bodies and the setting that was chosen to deposit them. So we have in the Boetanger Moor that enormous bog that I showed you. We have I think 4 or 5 bog bodies there, but others are also found in similar smaller depressions. I think Zwelo, for example. There must be a few more examples, but it's more diverse than you would think. So there are more bog bodies known from from settings similar to either, then I think what most people would think that they are deposited in pristine, untouched, large bogs far away from the living world. I think that's less common than you might anticipate.
Okay, thanks, Jelle, for that question. Ingrid Lummers has a question, raised her hand. Please, Ingrid.
Yes, thanks. I'm a bit less familiar with Zoom, so I try to, oh, there I go. Maybe I'm visible. Thanks, Roy, for your great presentation. Really nice to see all these beautiful maps. I was wondering, you showed the map, I think it was made by Cindy or co-made, with all these colored dots indicating the dating of the peat that was at the bottom, found at the bottom. And I think I saw, let's say, a red and a blue dot overlap, but there's supposed to be, let's say, a couple of 1,000 years in between. So how is that possible at such a short distance that the peat starts growing at such a different time? Apparently?
Yeah, I think what Cindy partly did was to try and get a few good transects through smaller areas of bog. So at a few spots we had those cover sand ridges which are inside of the central part of the bog and were gradually, or maybe not even gradually, overgrown with peat. So we took transects and then sampled there, and what you then could see is that in some cases you had indeed quite substantial differences in the ages of those bogs. And I think this, well, there has been a theory that the growth of bog in the northeastern Netherlands has been very gradual, so that it happened between the Mesolithic and the Middle Ages until people start reclaiming them, for example. And whereas other people say that it also could have sometimes accelerated and then stopped and then accelerate again, and then dry phases and warm and wetter phases. I think at least that what this image showed is that it's far more complex, and indeed that you have different cores maybe in which you had early formation of peat layers, even dating back to the late glacial, and it wasn't on this figure, but the valleys have really old peat in it. Whereas in other parts you may have indeed peat dating from the Roman period. So there could indeed within a few kilometers be very large differences depending on the context.
Yeah, I think I understand, and I think also the map showed that. But then these two dots seem to be overlapping. So within, let's say, maybe 100 meters, but maybe because of climatic differences, different topography at that place, it's still possible. Listening to your story now.
You would have to ask Cindy. I'm not sure if she's attending now, but I can imagine that you have, I also saw that in other bogs that you had, for example, smaller depressions in a larger peatland area, and that peat inception started in those depressions, which can sometimes contain indeed early Holocene or maybe even older peat, and that that then actually the peat grew out of these depressions, and then at some point, more or less covers the whole landscape. But that process can take quite long, I think. Yeah,
maybe that's that. I think I have my answer. Must be something like that. Yeah.
I have complex, I'm afraid.
I might ask Cindy another time if she says the same thing. If there's, well, I have a very small second question, if I'm allowed.
Very short, because we also need time for the break. So, and there's also a question from Melanie, but Melanie, with your permission, I'll shift that to the group discussion after the presentation.
Oh, it is very short.
Yeah.
It's just the meaning of Gerolkeule or something. It's
Gerolkeule. That's a Mesolithic type of artifact which is perforated and may have been used for digging to collect roots, for example. But it's a mysterious type of find. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
I can show you one at some point.
Yes, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ingrid, for that question. Melanie, we'll take your question to the group discussion, and we'll take a few minutes break now. Let's say 3 minutes, and then we're back, and then we'll start immediately with the presentation of Floor.
If you like, you can also put it in the chat, Melanie, so I can think about it.
It's already in the chat.
Oh, it's already? Okay.
Yeah. So we'll come back to that. Okay, thank you. See you in 3 minutes from now.
3.
Good. You're unmuted, so you can do that.
Right. Welcome back, everyone. We'll start with the second part, I think, if everyone over there is ready. Right, we'll just keep going then. So I'm Huisman. I'm a curator of archaeology at the Drents Museum, where we have a lot of really nice bog finds, some of which we'll show you in a moment in a video that we made last week when Roy and Kate came over to the museum. But before we show that video, I wanted to just briefly talk a little bit about bogs as both natural and cultural landscapes, something which is already clear, I think, from Roy's talk already. I wanted to talk about bog finds in museums and why they're important. I wanted to talk specifically a little bit about the bog finds at the Drents Museum, so our own collection of bog finds, and then we'll show you the video that we made last week. And I'll finish with a summary and some questions for discussion afterwards. So yes, many people look at bog landscapes like the Portobello Veen, which also appeared in Roy's talk, as a natural landscape, which are protected by organizations like Natuurmonumenten, and focus on biodiversity and nature, which is of course very important, because we have so few of these landscapes left. But they are also definitely cultural landscape. A variety of activities took place in these landscapes throughout prehistory and the historic period. And these include, of course, votive deposition of bog bodies like Tollenpan, as you can see in these reconstruction drawings or these drawings, and also of many objects, which we'll see in the video in a moment. And these are, of course, ritual activities, but a great number of practical, more practical kind of activities also happen in these places. And these include hunting and collecting plants, peat digging already in the Iron Age, for instance, in Denmark, curing leather, seasoning wood, storing foodstuffs, collecting bog iron or grazing your cattle, all sorts of things. And of course, many of these more mundane activities, so to speak, do not leave archaeological traces, but I just wanted you to be aware that they are also taking place in these landscapes. But we are mostly looking at the bog finds, the things that are left, the votive, many of them are votive offerings in these landscapes. And they are very popular with the wider public, which is no wonder, because many of them are very special. Think about, this beautiful golden necklace from Ireland, or the Trundholm sun disk from the Copenhagen Museum, or the clothes from a woman, Oldenburg's woman, also in Copenhagen. They're very special, very unique, and people love them. But then you also have less rich finds, you could say, like things like the wooden plow you can see in the right hand, or the keg of butter in the right hand corner. And although they seem less exciting, they are still very, very interesting and tell amazing tales, which we'll go into in the video in a moment. And I think what's exciting about all these finds, and of course bog bodies particularly, is that they bring us face to face with the past. They really allow you to get close to the people back then. And of course Tollenpan is a famous example. You literally stare into the face of an Iron Age man and you feel like he could wake up. He's in the bottom left corner. But yeah, it's true for all bog bodies, including Grauwallerman, you also see on the slide, and ISRIC reconstruction that Roy already showed. The bog finds at the Drents Museum, they are mentioned quite early on, or bog finds in Drent are mentioned quite early on, as you can see in this nice quote from 1658. All sorts of stones, jewelry, parts of weapons. And then later in 1792, they mention leather jackets, rough hats, shoes, pots, stone hearts, hedges, ditches, roads, horns of oxen and deer, animal teeth, and other objects, which one finds below the bog. So they found lots of stuff in the bogs in Drenthe, and they even mention it in some sources. And if we then go to the collection in the Drents Museum, I can give you a few examples, starting with these deer antlers, of which we have quite a few. This is a Neolithic disc wheel, wooden disc wheel, cornstones, wooden artifacts like bowls and plowshares and clubs, clothing, shoes and hats, for instance, pottery, balls of wool. We've got several coin hoards, including this one from Roswinkel, cattle horns. We've got jewelry like these beautiful necklaces, lots of weapons and tools as well. And of course, human remains, including both whole bog bodies, but also parts of bog bodies, like this arm and the small hand from Bijster, and also human hair braids. And these finds date from a very long period, as you can see here. People start putting things in bog in the Neolithic, and the practice of putting all sorts of things, this great variety of objects essentially into bogs lasts all the way into, basically almost into the modern period, definitely into the medieval period. So that's after Christianity is introduced, which is an interesting point that we'll come back to in the video in a moment, because of course these kind of pagan practices were forbidden when Christianity was introduced. Now, the finds at the Drents Museum mostly were found during peat digging from the 16th century onwards. And many of them were lost, but luckily some remained, and we have them now in our collection. And initially they were interpreted as items that people lost. Well, you've just seen them on the slide. It's very unlikely that you just lose a quernstone or a big wagon wheel or a ball of wool or some hair braids in a bog. So we now interpret these finds, as Roy also explained, as votive offerings. Bogs are probably important ritual landscapes. And people went there to deposit things, to get into touch, or to ask favors of higher powers, gods, of we don't know exactly what, but they made offerings essentially in these landscapes. But the fact that these objects are votive offerings, that's not the only thing you can talk about when you look at these things. There's so much more to tell. They can tell us about people's landscape perceptions and the way they interacted with bogs. They tell us about past people, of course, the people who owned these items, who made them, who deposited them. They tell us something about their lives and their societies. And they even can say something about us, because when you start thinking about these kind of tales, these kind of stories, you quickly start seeing similarity and also differences between us and people in the past. And that's something that I'm also thinking about in the context of our new collection presentation, which opens next year. There's a bog in this bog. There is a bog in this presentation. No, there's a room dedicated to bog finds in this presentation, where we'll show many of the highlights in our bog object collections. Essentially what I want to do there is not just focus on the ritual aspects and the votive offerings, but also on how they link back to daily life and society in the past. But I also really want to think about the present. So what do these objects mean for us, to us, and how do they speak to us? So in this room, you'll hear stories from the people who basically owned or deposited or made these objects and put them in the bogs. And I'm hoping to create a link between the people then and the visitor now. So we'll show you the video of the stores of the objects that we made last week. Before I do so, though, I wanted to have a quick look at where the objects that we look at fit in terms of time, because we don't go through them in a chronological way, more in thematical fashion. So we start with some objects from the Middle Bronze Age, including parts of the famous Wageningen temple, which Roy already mentioned, and some cattle horns. Then we go back to the late Neolithic, to this wooden disc wheel. Then we move forward to a group of very personal finds, including a shoe and hair braids and a ball of wool from the Bronze and the Iron Ages. Then we go back for two special finds, very unique prestige items in the early Bronze Age. And we end with a small hand from Bijster in the medieval period. So yeah, I think we can switch to the video. Okay, let's start with these finds, which are two wooden parts of the famous temple of Barge-Oosterveld, which you'll probably both know and some of you may know as well. It looked like this. It's a wooden structure, relatively simple. It was built in the bog near Barge Oosterveld, where it was found during peat digging in 1957. What you see on this table is one big wooden peg, which was used to basically fix the planks on which the temple was staying into the boggy ground. So people knew exactly how to build in this environment, which is very interesting. It shows us that they often entered this bog very often. And then this is one of the horn-shaped pieces that was once adorning probably the top of the temple, as you can see in this reconstruction. It's called horn-shaped, well, because it looks a bit like a cattle horn, and that's also why I've picked these finds, which are 2 cattle horns from Kleindijk. They were found in a group of 6 originally, and we know that at least one of these horns is from a male cow, so a bull or a bullock. Together, essentially, these finds tell us something about the importance of cattle in Bronze Age society, because I haven't mentioned it yet, but both of these finds are dated to the Bronze Age, and cattle was very important in that society. So in that respect, it tells us something about the ritual things that were going on in the bogs. As you can see, this temple, which probably had some ritual meaning, but it also tells us something about daily life and food economy. Well, I've already hinted a little bit, I think, at the importance of cattle based on the finds that we have before us, parts of the Barge Oosterveld temple and these cattle horns. And yeah, as I said, cattle was a very important commodity almost in Bronze Age society, but clearly also had ideological and symbolic value. And that's what I really like about these kind of finds, that they're ritual, obviously, they're votive offerings in a temple-like structure, but at the same time they say something about something that's very important in daily life and in Bronze Age culture. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think indeed it's a very common theme in depositions that there's a link with cattle. And what I think is also interesting is that it's something that apparently happens time and again in bog depositions, because we know about 100 instances, but maybe they're not the most attractive finds to be collected by peat cutters. So there must have been a lot more than that have been deposited.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas the temple in some ways seems unique, which is another interesting.
Yeah,
interesting fact.
It's really is a one-off. There are some. Seemingly there are some parallels in Germany, but they are, and in other parts of Europe, but they're never exactly the same as this one. And what I find intriguing about it is that they are also that this temple is probably made on the spot, because there have been wood chips that have been found on the spot. So it seems to have been built there, and all the raw materials have been brought to the place from probably from the nearby Hondsrug, the higher sandy soils.
Yeah.
So they brought them with the specific intention to create a building over there that lasted for at least for some time, right?
Yeah, exactly. Before they then took it down again and put it in the bog. And it's interesting you say it's from the sandy grounds, and it's like it's connecting 2 landscapes almost, right? It's the peaty landscape, and it's then also the higher sandy grounds, which is really interesting. I'm also wondering what you think, Kate, when you see these things. What makes you think about lives lived, which is something that you're interested in?
Well, Roy mentioned a wood chip, and in my mind's eye I can see exactly where that chip came from. It's a depression with a sharp end, and it feels like that's where the axe caught a hardness in the wood and would have stopped. And so that's the point that I'm fixing on and intrigued about. That makes me think what kind of wood it was. I think I read it was oak. But what was the landscape people were living in? Was it extensively wooded and oak landscape?
I think Roy probably knows more about the landscape.
I know a little bit about landscape. It's I think you can imagine indeed that the people who built this temple were living on the Hondsrug, the higher sandy soils. So the sediments were over there, and based from palynology, we know that there at this point still must have been quite extensive forests. So people started cutting the forests, but in Middle Bronze Age times, you still had a significant amount of deciduous forest, and that included indeed oak. And what you see later on in prehistory is that the landscape is becoming more and more open spots, more heathland developing over time. But in this phase, it's still at least partly forested.
Right. Well, this is the second find I wanted to show you. Again made of wood, again oak wood, and it's a disc wheel from the Neolithic. So it's about 3,000 years old, essentially, the late Neolithic specifically. And that's also what makes it very interesting. It's a very kind of basic wheel made from one piece of wood. And these wheels appear in Drenthe in the Netherlands in this specific period. Before that, the people here, actually the TRB people who built the Hunebedden, for instance, didn't have wheels, or at least we don't think they did. There's no evidence for it. But then suddenly, from the late Neolithic onwards, we do find wheels, and they end up in bogs as well. And that's very interesting, very intriguing, and it's probably to do with a group of people that comes into, or small groups of people that come into the Netherlands from further east in Europe. Okay, yeah, so as I just said, wheels like this suddenly appear, well suddenly, but they appear at a specific point in time, which is the late Neolithic, and it seems that they are introduced essentially by people from the east. These were probably nomadic people, hence the wagon wheels and the wagon parts. What's interesting about it is that this is a new kind of technology in Drenthe and in the Netherlands at this point in time, at least for the people who live here. But equally, they end up in bogs, and of course, depositing things in bogs is a very old tradition that's local to Drenthe and the Netherlands. So it seems that you have these two traditions merging. So you've got the old tradition, the local tradition of putting things in bogs that are important, and then you've got new people coming in for whom the wheel is probably very important symbolically as well, and they kind of take over this practice, or these two kind of cultures merge, and they start depositing wheels in bogs as well, which is I think a really nice story.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how these recent ADNA studies have actually overturned all kinds of ideas in Dutch archaeology, yeah. And this is indeed one story that is connected to them, but there are also other stories I think that you could link to it, like for example, the first construction of barrows in large parts of the Netherlands, including Drenthe, is also a novel feat, yeah. And it's also indeed very interesting to see how this has shifted the complete Dutch archaeology, or maybe European archaeology in general, because earlier we were allowed to talk about migrations.
Exactly,
and that completely was gone for some time, and now it almost feels like we're back in that
sense again.
In that sense again, and this also tells the story about indeed people entering the bogs, right, in a specific way, with real traffic even.
Yeah. Well, and it says something about the importance of transport, and it is symbolic. It has a symbolic meaning. There's no practical reason for a wheel to end up in the bog.
Yeah.
It was a deposition, and it must have had a symbolic meaning as well, which I think is very nice. And what's also interesting is that you can see it back in the language, like our words for wheel and axle and all sorts of wagon parts actually also come from Indo-European languages brought in with these migrants. So it's not just the DNA, it's not just the objects, it's also you can also see it in language, which is very interesting.
It was a huge change in Dutch prehistory. Yeah.
What do you think, Kate? What are your thoughts on this beautiful wheel?
I'm fascinated by what you just said about the introduction of new words into the language. Because as I understand it, you wouldn't know the names of any individuals or anything about the language of these people. But the traces that we still have is through the technology.
Yeah, and it went the other way around as well, because these people were nomads, whereas the people here were kind of farming, like, mostly stayed in more or less the same place. So all kind of words for farming and so on are actually local. So, you end up with a Muslim mixture. So again, it's a nice kind of two-way process. It's not like one group comes in and kind of pushes out the other. It's an interaction between the two.
Yeah.
Right, so this next group, which are these objects essentially, are some of my personal favorites, and they're a very good example of really personal objects, I would say. So we've got two shoes over here. This one's from the Bronze Age and that one's from the Iron Age. Very simple shoes made of one piece of leather essentially, though the later one has a small bit of leather at the back to make it a bit more comfortable than the earlier shoe, and a piece of string that kind of would have been used to kind of pull it around the foot. So that's the shoes. Then there is this tiny ball of wool from the Roswinkeler vein, still on a bit of peat, as you can see, which I really like. So you bring a bit of the landscape with the find. You can see a little bit of its context. And as you can see, it's very well preserved, and you wouldn't say that it's from the Iron Age as well.
So yeah, more than 2,000 years old, essentially, almost 3,000. And then this one, which is again a block of turf with 2 human hair braids on it, both consisting of 3 strands. And when you look very carefully, you see under the braids, you can see bits of textile still. So it looks like they were once wrapped in a bit of cloth or something before they were put into the bog. So yeah, as I said, as I just mentioned, they are some of my personal favorites because they bring us so close to past people. I mean, these shoes, for instance, all shoes essentially are seen as votive offerings, simply because they are found in a bog. And yeah, when you find a pair of shoes, clearly they've been left, you know, purposefully. But everyone who's been in a bog probably knows what a bog is like, you know. So I can totally imagine that some of these shoes that we find are actually just lost, you know. Mm-hmm. People got stuck or something. And yeah, I think it's a nice kind of very, very tangible image, someone just walking and losing a shoe.
Just a personal item that's left in a bog. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think the most striking thing also is that so these shoes are actually relatively common. I mean, it's not you will not find them every day, but they occur more frequently in European bogs. But for example, finds like this, like the wool and the hair braids are extremely rare.
Yes.
Actually. And,
yeah, they are. Yeah. The wool especially. I mean, hair braids we have a few more of in Germany and in Denmark, for instance, but the wool we don't. And that's not just that's making it very special and very valuable, but also, you know, people look at it and think, oh, it's just a ball of wool, that's not very special. And, you know, the finds we'll discuss later on, they are actually really valuable. Mm-hmm. But if you think about all the kind of work and time and skill and craft that goes into this, from raising the sheep to plucking them to, you know, washing the wool, spinning it into a ball, it is actually quite valuable. It's the craft and the time and the labor that goes into it, and that makes it special.
Yeah, and at the same time, it's not a finished product. I mean, you can use it for weaving and then make it into a finished end product, obviously.
Exactly.
But it's
very interesting.
Yeah, it's even more. And indeed, as you say, I like the form of this turf of the where the hair braids are, and you can just see someone cutting turf and then being completely surprised when these braids actually turn up.
Yeah, and out of all of these, this is of course the most personal thing because it's actually part of a person. It's an actual person that cut off their hair and put it in a bog. And hair is very symbolic. Like in ancient Greece, they made hair sacrifices at important points in life. So you know, when they were born, when they were married, or when they died. So maybe something similar happened here.
Some rite of passage.
Yeah, exactly.
At some point. Yeah.
But all these finds, like you can almost see the person, right? You can almost touch them, and that's what I really like about this particular group. What are your thoughts, Kate? Because I know you've got a special interest in the shoes, for instance, and the hair braids.
You have got hair braids yourself.
I do. Well, if I'm going to choose one thing to say, which I'm flooded with the impressions, it would be about the impression of the textile underneath the braid.
Yeah.
And how to you can read that and see that they had wrapped the braids. Mm-hmm. And how much that adds to an understanding of the significance of those.
Yeah.
Would you know any more about how this might have happened?
Well, as I said, like we think it's a very personal gift, right? You know, I think like the wagon wheel or the temple would have involved a group of people, right? It would be a slightly bigger group, bigger offering. This, I think, is probably something very personal. One person asking for a specific thing, or you know, offering a particular gift. So yeah, that makes it very interesting. Unfortunately, we'll never know why they did it, but maybe that mystery is quite nice as well. So we just looked at some very personal finds, some very kind of daily objects, you would say. And the next group that we'll look at are these two, which you could actually call real bog treasures. They're very exotic prestige items. We have a necklace from Exlo, or found in Exlo, I should say, which consists of various materials, beads of various materials. So there's amber, and there is faience, and there is tin, and one bronze bead. And what's very special about it, other than the fact that it's these different materials, is that most of these materials come from far away. Amber can be collected in the Netherlands, and some of these beads, especially the rougher ones, are probably local. But the rest seem to be beads from a spacer, an amber spacer necklace found in southern England. So they've basically reused these beads. They're nicely shaped, they're beautifully worked. They've reused them and put them in this necklace. That's one of the heirlooms in this necklace, but you also have the bronze bead, the tubular bead as they call it. And that is another heirloom, it seems. That may have been a small thing that was attached to some clothing at one point. So again, this is an heirloom that was incorporated into this necklace. And of course the tin and the bronze are both not local either. They also have to come from southern England. And again, the faience chemically is very similar to faience from England or Ireland. So it seems that all of these beads essentially are exotic, apart from a few of the amber beads. And yeah, it makes it a very special object, which probably came here via trade links with southern England, maybe via a group of people in the Netherlands, the Hilversum culture, which lived in the Netherlands. So that's the necklace. And then we have the beautiful dagger from Water Oosterveld. Similar kind of time, also early Bronze Age. It's a blade, a metal blade with a very low percentage of tin, which tells us that it's a very early metal, fitted into a horn handle with tiny tin nails almost to keep it in place. And you can see the damage here. It was struck when it was found by the peat digger who found it. But yeah, it's a very early blade. It's one of the earliest metal objects in the Netherlands, which is exciting, but it's also, again, from far away. This is a kind of dagger that you would find in Central Europe. And it made its way to Drents, again, probably via long-distance trade networks. And I think the stories to tell here, I think, are about the importance of these long-distance contacts, these social networks that clearly spread far beyond Drenthe. Both into Central Europe, but also into the south of England. So that's one thing, especially because, of course, social networks and kind of trade contacts are very important still today. And then another thing is the fact that these items compose of all these different, in the case of the necklace, of all these different materials, tell a very interesting story which connects so many different people from different places, from different time periods. And that kind of probably gave it a kind of magical property, almost amuletic value. It was a very special object, and the person or persons owning it, make a statement about their status or their ability to have such an object, to own it, to deposit it as well. And the same goes for the dagger. In some ways, it's a prestige item. It's not something to be used, it's something to be shown, kind of signifying a sort of warrior status maybe that became more and more important throughout the Bronze Age, which is interesting. And again, that's something that we're familiar with, right? You're using pretty things or bling bling to show particular aspects of your status or your identity.
Yeah, I think the composite character of exactly that Exlo find is really special. That it is composed of different elements which already had a life history behind itself before they were put together in a necklace and ended up their life in a bog in Drenthe, an area which you would perhaps be inclined to think that it was more or less isolated, a small farming community, but actually there were far more ties with the wider world, so to say. So that's, I think, really interesting. And it also reminds me of the early hoards, bronze hoards that we have in the Netherlands, and Wageningen is a good example of that, very close to the World Soil Museum. Where you have a hoard that's composed of materials that comes from all kinds of different places of Europe, and also the composition of the metal is often not very straightforward, but it seems to come from different parts of Europe sometimes, especially in the transition phase from late Neolithic to early Bronze Age, and then onwards to the start of the Middle Bronze Age.
Yeah, and that's also what's the case with that one. In the paper about this dagger, it said that essentially you can't really call it bronze yet because there's so little tin in it that it's not actually really bronze yet, and that also shows where it comes from, and I think that's a very interesting point. And I just wonder what the statement is that people want to make by are they indeed like emphasizing these long distance contacts and the fact that kind of gives them a particular status, or look at how many friends and contacts I have in these distant areas. It's interesting to think about. Yeah, surely. Yeah, and some of these necklaces, for example, they come from burials as well, but it's still very rare. Yeah, and they're all individual in one-offs. So
so they have a very specific character indeed.
Very
And it also indeed the background of these objects also makes the story behind it. So the provenance, I should actually say.
Yeah.
So that's why we interpret such finds as being special,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
I'm not sure if you want to reflect on that specifically.
Your discussion has really made me understand it through this object more about how the really technical scientific sides of archaeology matches the more humanities thing of creating the history of it. And what I hadn't thought about up till now is the sort of horizontal distribution, like these things are precious because they come from far away. But I think what you also said, they're precious because they come from different time periods as well, which
Yes.
I just can't see by looking at it.
No, exactly. And you need to be a specialist, right, to recognize that. But I think definitely the heirlooms specifically, you know, they come from people long dead, maybe ancestors who held a particular power. And that's also why, you know, there is speculation about this necklace having maybe an amuletic value or magical properties. And the same goes for the materials in it. Amber is often thought of as a magical, and of course metal, when it was, you know, first introduced, must have been quite special. You can create a new material. That's a magical thing. It's very special. So yeah, very interesting. Right. So the last find we want to look at is this small hand, the hand of Wijster, which is all that remains of a group of bog bodies that was found in 1901. There were 4 bodies in total, young men probably in the age of 15 to 25. And they were found covered with elder twigs, and besides the bodies we found some clothing, a copper kettle and a handful of coins dating to the late, did you say 1580s?
1580s, yeah.
Late 16th century. And that's interesting because, you know, we know bog bodies from prehistoric context, and of course in the 16th century we're in a very different world. It's a Christian world in which kind of pagan, you know, practices like putting things in bogs isn't allowed. So what's going on here? They could have been, you know, maybe murder victims, or perhaps they were punished somehow and you know, buried in a place that isn't normal, a bog, because they weren't part of a community. But then you have these weird things that were found with them, the copper kettle and the coins, and also the elder branches they were covered with. So it does make you wonder, is it maybe somehow still related to this old practice of depositing in bogs? Because we do, of course, not just have this particular find from the medieval period. We have lots of finds from the medieval period, from the early medieval period, the Roman period, and the later medieval period, of deposits in bogs, which clearly do refer back to that old practice of you know, offering things in bogs. Presumably because Christianity didn't really have this kind of direct relationship that you could have in that way. You put something in a bog for a higher power and ask for help, which in Christianity just doesn't quite feel the same. But yeah, it remains an enigmatic find. We don't really know. Yeah. Essentially.
Yeah, it's a very difficult site to interpret, especially also because it's got 4 individuals instead of 1.
Yeah.
And then if you look, for example, in medieval and post-medieval Scotland and the United Kingdom, you also sometimes have younger bodies, but then they're more often single bodies. I think you can probably find exceptions to that, but it's finding 4 bodies at the same spot is actually a quite rare thing.
Yeah.
So it is difficult to say whether it indeed had this ritual connotation, but as you stress, indeed, we have a whole series of other votive deposits or assumed votive deposits, for example, published by Wijnand van der Sanden and Vincent van Vilsteren, who indeed think that these pagan practices, so to speak, pagan practices, continued after, actually for many centuries after the Christianization took place. And and there were even issues, there were even documents issued by the Christian Church to say, please stop offering stuff in bogs. You can't do this. It's illegitimate. Yeah. And but then still it kept happening until indeed 16th, 17th century onwards. And that's, I think, indeed fascinating about this story.
Yeah, what I also like about that is that it tells us something about the bog and the way people perceived it, right? Because you know, there was a time when it was perceived as a very negative place and very dangerous and you know, scary, and we'll talk about that in a different session, I think, from Peatland Exchanges. But you wonder, you know, what way prehistoric people and, you know, people in the medieval period looked at this landscape and how they related to it. And it seems to be very different from, you know, the way we sometimes look at it. Well, we look at it like nature, and then, you know, 100 years, 200 years ago, it was a landscape to be extracted from. It was just economic. So you see these changing perceptions, and I think archaeological finds for all periods are really good at kind of showing you different perceptions of the landscape.
Showing you the nuance, because you would be inclined to think either a bog is an economic landscape for exploitation, or it is a ritual landscape. But I think it's more nuanced than that, and could probably be both at the same time.
Exactly.
Depending on time of day or time of year, maybe.
Yeah, and the first finds we showed in this kind of talk clearly showed that, right? There were ritual finds, but clearly connected to daily life, and the two can't really be separated. Yeah. I'm wondering what you're thinking about this particular find, Kate.
This piece is the most enigmatic because it combines nature and culture more than any of the others. I think it's a hand, it's reaching out, and it's a human remain. But what is a bog body? You can't call it just a bog or a body, it's a bog body. I don't know, is that the same in Dutch?
Yes.
We call it veen-like. Yeah. It's the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it combines nature and culture more than any of the other pieces, I think. And as you've been talking, I've come to an understanding of a little more of the understanding of the intense scientific research that goes into the object itself, and the intense scrutiny that you pay to the cultural histories as well. So there's two sides to being an archaeologist. And finally, when we're talking about being in the museum, and I'm seeing it now very differently than I've ever seen a find before. I can see it in 3D, I can take distance and zoom in on a detail. In this circumstance, I'm more able to construct my own story, project my own meaning, and I really hugely respect what a museum does in helping frame that, and the work that you do in conversations with researchers.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean, the tales we've told here today are just, you know, one option or maybe two out of many. I think that's something that we could discuss back in the World Soil Museum. Like, how do we tell these tales? Which tales do we tell? Why do we focus on those particular aspects? And I agree with you, Kate. This is so enigmatic, and it's connecting, you know, people, connecting us to people in the past, and it's connecting us to the peatland, and, you know, so there's a whole network basically that exists around this one find, which is very special. Okay, welcome back in the World Soil Museum. I hope you enjoyed this little video. I've got two more slides just to summarize. Sorry. Oh yeah, that's wrong. Sorry. Yeah, okay. Sorry. Yeah, two more slides, and then I think Kate will take over because we're running a bit late. I hope you can now all see this. Yeah, this is a summary of the tales from the bog. So as you've seen, these bog finds have rich biographies, rich and multi-layered biographies. They tell many tales, really. And just about past people and their lives, for instance, about their societies and their worldview, about their perceptions and the perceptions of their interaction with bogs, and perhaps even us. We've drawn some links between the past and the present. The museum's role, of course, is selecting what stories we tell. And I think the aim should be to connect people in the past with people now, so visitors now. For instance, by looking at the relevance of bog finds today. And that's what I'm trying to do in the new collection presentation next year as well. Some questions for discussion, if there's time. As I already mentioned, which tales do we tell in museums? I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this. What would you like to hear? How do we integrate this natural and cultural element of past peatlands in museum displays? And again, we're working on that in our new collection presentation, but I'd be keen to hear your thoughts. And what's the relevance or the significance of these bog finds to current society and to you? How do they speak to you, essentially? And that was me. Just to say a big thank you to these people, particularly Maria, who you haven't seen, but who was also in the Drents Museum and who filmed and edited the film.
in about a week's time. So thank you very much, Maria. And here are the credits for the images. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Floor. That was fascinating, and yeah, it was really great to see this very special objects in your collection, in the collection of the Drents Museum. And yeah, the discussion among you three already revealed a lot, but also sparks more questions, of course. Maybe since we are pressed with time, we will shift most of the questions to the group discussion. I'm sure there will be various questions. I wrote down a list of them, but maybe I take the liberty as a moderator to ask something from my own perspective that Kate referred to actually in the last part of your group discussion in the museum, is that you have a fascinating collection. What is the entry point for your collection? What do you collect? And how do you formulate the value of your collection? Obviously, there's various functions. One is to tell tales, but also maybe research. And so what is the common denominator for collecting in the collection you have?
Well, I think so we started out as a provincial museum, so it was basically looking at finds from Drenthe. And of course, the Bourtange vein was in Drenthe, which is why a lot of the bog finds ended up in the Drents Museum. And of course, we're still interested in them, but as Roy said, they're not really found in these days. But we don't, of course, just have bog finds. We also have finds from the sandy soils and the drier parts of Drenthe. And I guess the aim of our museum is to, like you said, tell stories about Drenthe. You know, we want to show the world Drenthe, but it's also the other way around. We want to show Drenthe the world. So we want to kind of connect the two. We want to kind of collect objects that help us do that, essentially. And that's also what we're hoping to do in the new collection presentation next year. We'll be showing our own collection from Drenthe, and that's art, archaeology, and history all together. But we don't just tell Drents stories. We tell basically human stories about human life, about people, what makes us human, essentially.
Right, and this necklace already was a nice connection to that you see the connection between people in different places on Earth. And,
yeah.
And how large is the collection? How many pieces do you have in your collection as an estimate? And how much of the or maybe how many percent is presented in the museum, because you have a large store to select from us.
I wouldn't dare to say. Okay. I do know that archaeology is the biggest sub part, because that's where it started with. Like, it started as an archaeological museum, and then later on the art and history was added. But I would need to check. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah.
Okay. But much larger than what it's all need to be seen.
Yes,
in the museum,
yes,
right?
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
and of
people
course,
don't often realize that. But...
No, yeah, there's a lot more in the stores, and these finds will be on display because they are great pieces. And then there's a lot in the store, and there's a great research potential as well. There's so much still to do.
Exactly.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Flora. We'll see you back in the group discussion, and now we get the floor to Kate.
Let me switch the on.
Thank you, Lee, for sorting all this. Hello, everyone. I'm going to rattle through what I have to say. There'll be some actual rustling from the paper because I'm going to read to make sure that I say all that I find important. I'm Kate Foster, an environmental artist. I'll be talking about lives lived, weaving above and below the surface. I've focused on peat since 2016. And my first talk in this exchange series was about finding ways of sensing a peat bog in time. I also introduced my Scottish project, Peat Cultures, and how this continued as vein culture alongside the home turf and wet futures research. Peatland Exchanges marks the outset of my residency in the World Soil Museum. It has the overall theme of valuing wetlands and their soils. And I will be putting all my talks on the blog as we go along. Today's session has shown how peat bogs yield information about prehistoric human cultures, when people inhabited a very varied local environment. Imagining lives lived, it's easy to be anthropocentric, human-centered, but the way that things are preserved in peatlands makes us weave above and below ground and explore the margins of nature and culture. Waiting for the next slide. It's about to come. Yay. My exchanges today are 3 dedications. First, for the World Soil Museum, with its mission for soil conservation. And then for the 2 research talks we have just heard. Color-wise, I'll be moving from gold and red through to brown. My themes move from treasuring, offering, and textures. Textures that can make negative space positive. I'll give a flavour of what's happening in my project studio in the World Soil Museum. As exchanges thicken, it gains more inspirations. So to start with the theme treasuring. The altered compost bag I'm showing this week has a drawing of a Roman golden helmet. The compost bag contained peat and was used in a Dutch garden. But why this helmet? The pale helm, as it is, stands out as a gleaming find in the industrial era of peat extraction. It had sat with a number of other objects under the surface of a Brabant bog at Deurne. In 1910, a hand labourer called Peter Fink found it. He thought at first it was an ancient tree, a common find, but his golden discovery led to great excitement and even a judicial case about who owned it. As I understand, the current display of this helmet at the Leiden Museum of Antiquities unpacks different tales of why it was deposited in a peat bog, asking, are these fact or fiction? I've heard that peat itself, a commodity in the industrial era, was called brown gold. Peat isn't extracted anymore in the Netherlands, but Dutch horticulturalists and gardeners are great users of imported peat. This is an urgent environmental issue, so that's why I combined a golden helmet with a peat bag. And it's a question about what we value. Museums are repositories of what we treasure. They keep studying their collections and reviewing the stories they tell. Let's move back to the Drents Museum. So to the red section, offering. Flora's enthusiasm about the different stories of these objects is infectious. She makes sure the presentation reflects contemporary knowledge. I love how she included objects of humble materials, things which are on the edge of being nature or culture. A theme in the discussion in the museum was the idea of people over the ages making offerings. For example, the disc wheel in the front of this image. And the necklace too. It seems some people in prehistory gathered great riches, but were also prepared to let go of them. In what archaeologists term ritual depositions, and that a peat bog was often chosen as a place to do this. Now, talking of peat bogs, here's one I made for the last session on hydrology. I also made an hourglass from a testate amoebae and pot, responding to Cindy Quick's presentation of peat bogs as an archive of time. As a recap, I'm creating a cast of characters, none of which are human, that can be conceptualized as peatland stakeholders. They're in the form of shadow puppets. And if a narrative develops from these characters, it will need to be a collaborative effort to generate a performance. So, what might I create inspired by a visit to the Drents Museum stores? This shoe tempts the imagination. Who wore it? And along what tracks did they walk? Which animal was killed for its skin? How do you tell if something is a sacrifice or simply lost? Moving away from bigger questions, I was intrigued by tiny marks cut in lines across the leather that had for so long lain pickled, preserved in the bog. My sketchbook, I already had patterns of shoes copied from figures in archaeological research. Apparently, shoes were a fairly common find, especially when the peat bogs were dug away in the industrial era. This second sketchbook page began with a shoe pattern traced out in an analysis of the shoe found along with the body of Amcott woman in England. I thought the shape could create a distinctive shadow. So why was the next drawing red? After going to the Drents Museum last week, I reread a chapter by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She wrote how the bog sucks at your feet and that she had lost an old red sneaker on a previous research trip. She noticed that the peat bog had a proclivity for stealing footwear. How odd, she thought, that her sneaker would most likely outlive her. Somehow this made her glad that it was red. Perhaps it would become the most tangible sign of her brief presence on the planet. I'm intrigued by what makes us want to leave something enduring, or what can help accept making a less intangible legacy. And when are we prepared to give things up? What makes the loss tolerable? How do we construct stories after the event around circumstances? So here is a new figure dedicated to museum work, an idea combining a modern and prehistoric shoe. I want to think a little more about Kimmerer's story, which I highly recommend. Kimmerer is a contemporary US botanist as well as an indigenous thinker. She reflected on the feeling of losing something to the peat bog. Somehow a profane object became sacred once it was lost. So I wondered how I can symbolize the ambiguity between sacrifice and the everyday proclivities of bogs. In the museum collections, I saw how Peter created a magnificent array of bronze, tan, and deep browns in the organic materials it pickled. These colors are beautiful in their own right. Here I made the image begin to create shadows. A shoe provokes the idea of a footprint and the contemporary concept of ecological footprint. The question sneaks into my thoughts. Was the lost red shoe made of plastic? When we write stories, we do not include every detail. As Roy and Floor's work shows, revealing previously untold details can make a difference to interpretation. Exchanges, moving on to the brown section. Explaining the development of the next image, I'll start with a sketchbook page that I'm using as a motif for this particular talk. It came from looking at photos of the golden treasure from Lorup in an exhibition booklet from 2005 titled Treasures from the Bog. It was a major show appearing at Drents Museum and other locations. Of course, I want peat to be treasured as well. My note asks if the peat itself is valued, as well as the golden finds and the other pickled artifacts. I do understand that an overly sharp division between natural and cultural heritage can hinder joint conservation work, and how the two wetland projects are helping to bring this together. Now, in my consideration of brown textures, I'm turning back to a 2020 meeting which sparked the current series. This is an image Roy shared then. He described how he was inspired by a visit to the Drents Museum as a young person who was already fascinated by archaeology. He bought a recently published book with this map inside. The book was called Mantel Moras. It shows a part of the Botanga Moor where dozens of archaeological excavations revealed objects from different time periods. And seeing this map all those years ago helped Roy realize that people had interacted with bogs for millennia and that these landscapes had a special meaning. He added, but it also struck me how one-dimensional that image was. All these finds from different periods are plotted together on one simple map that lacks any form or detail. I wanted to know more, he said, and bring these finds and objects alive. Can a 2D object convey time depth? My 2020 drawing is a decorative motif for our whole series, Peatland Exchanges. I took away the black parallel lines from the map you just saw and let the objects float and create negative space. Here, they landed on a peat-coloured circle. Roy's knowledge base includes a detailed understanding of how well bogs can preserve materials. To me, his work seems to fill in the textures between the mapped finds. Prehistoric wood, whether worked by humans or lying where it had grown, creates characteristic textures. This is an earlier drawing of tree stumps called pale pauston, based on the site of ancient tree stumps emerging from the water surface as things get hotter and drier and the water table lowers. Think of the reconstructions we saw earlier of prehistoric forests by Ulko Klimmervein, and we saw a lot of oak wood in Drents museum stores. I stuck with one of my first impressions on the museum table. Here's a close-up of the Wageningen temple peg. I looked at the depression from which a chip had flown when this was made. The lifelines of the oak still run parallel, having once carried its nutrients and water. A rough texture on the left comes, I think, from where the axe left the wood. I rarely use an axe, but all the same, I know the feeling of trying to shape something and the frustration if you cut too deep. Innumerable oak chips must have flown as people shaped the abundant oak trees fell from the earliest times. As Roy said, wetter climate also brought changes to tree cover. We've lost the image, but you'll see it here, creating shadows. As well as the glory of creating the Wageningen temple, the Bronze Age was already changing the local ecology. This is my attempt to create fleeting patterns of oak wood through drawing and shadows. This is a homage both to the texture of the oak and the nuances of environmental archaeology. Not sure how long I've got left. I'd like to say something about what's going on in the project studio. As background, here's a sketch for an installation, which is a studio feel in the World Soil Museum, now open again on Wednesday afternoons. So indeed, this is where I can work once a week. Do visit. On the left, I'm setting out inspirations, other people's work and ideas. These are thickening as the series generates ideas. And on the section to the right, my sketches and shadow puppets section grows. In my mind, I keep going back to an earlier model I made as a means to think of transitions and lives lived. On the way back from Drents Museum, we went through Assen, where one of the most intact dugout canoes in Western Europe was discovered as a road was built, I think. Traveling on the motorway, I became part of the story. Last session, I mentioned that 3 years later, I returned a peat core extracted in a 2016 workshop as a symbolic act. I took it back to its bog, but I kept the boulder clay bottom layer and I found an image from the Assen canoe to work from. In the process, I made a drawing, which you can see on the bottom strip. I remembered how my father had taught me to row a boat by guiding my small hands as I held wooden oars. So this piece became my personal farewell to the Holocene, the geological era before our contemporary Anthropocene, when humans are impacting ecology and climate to breaking point. I want peat bogs to exist in future landscapes and to be a touchstone for personal reflection as well as collective action. So you've seen how the visit to Drents Museum stimulated 3 gold, red and brown images, and that experience can sit in a grey area between the personal and collective, and between happenstance and meaning. I imagine myself in future on a trackway, carrying my plaques in a cloth, leather shod. This might be a personal moment at a hinge in life, or it might be part of a great upheaval. Our main theme this session is the interplay of nature and culture, and I've made suggestions to help think of lives lived and how being in peatlands in imagination might help construct futures. I'll leave you with this picture of something the Drents Museum acquired in 1906, shown by the curators in the museum stores. This jar of samples seems to exemplify the porosity of nature and culture. It contains different slices of peat moss collected from across Europe. Each is of a different quality. Seems a good link between the Drents archaeological collections and the World Soil Museum. I heard very little is known about the jar's history. What motivated the selection now held within a glass jar? Was it an early interest in ecology? The collector most definitely had an eye for the textures of peat and placed value on its qualities. Thank you. Please do keep in touch with any corrections, comments, ideas, or inspirations.
Should be good to go.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Kate. That was thank you much for your reflection and overarching talk. And yeah, to think of a peat bog as something that could steal something from you, enlightening, and certainly those objects which you also brought alive in your art, out of like words that stuck to me were black gold and things frozen in time, and so they tell stories that relates again to the presentation of Paul, and also to the Roy of bringing, let's say, alive landscapes in different points in time. So,
Shift
yes,
this way a bit.
the floor is open for discussion, especially from the public. If you have questions for Roy, Floor, or Kate, and if you could bring the chats on the screen, I can do it here, right?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah.
So do you want to go back to the question of Melanie, maybe?
I think I already tried to answer it in the chat, but
Okay.
it's a very fascinating question, I think. And it shows how little we know compared to other countries sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the Netherlands are a wetland country with some really high quality wetland archaeology, and not just related to peat bogs. So I was also thinking about the western parts of the Netherlands, which are submerged, and we have some spectacular sites there as well, where you could study topics like she suggested. But in peatland environments, it's going to be more difficult. I would then think maybe look for smaller depressions or pingos that are filled with peat, which are close to settlement sites. Then it could have potential, but it's a tricky one. Yeah.
Right. And the question I have is that you said that in the folklore thing, or yeah, that well, now it's all cultural landscape, which means that it's difficult to have new findings. Most findings are from before 1950. But with the new sensing techniques, does that add something to know if there are things deeper below? To help to have more findings in the current peat areas.
Yeah, I think you mainly refer to Boertang and Morna, which is and with Vochterlo is only partly reclaimed. So we did some tests with ground penetrating radar, for example. So it's a sensing technique which sends waves into the ground basically in Wageningen with students, and then you can actually see especially different stratigraphical layers. So it's more difficult to detect archaeological remains in bogs, because often it will be needles and haystacks. So I wouldn't use it as a technique to find or to predict model where artifacts or something. That's going to be too difficult, I think. Maybe in trackway research, I could envision could work that, but that has not been tested. I think they would rather probe with a stick to see even nowadays. Yeah.
Do you have any reflections to the other talks? Meanwhile, I'll look at the chat.
Was the question about the wheel in the third?
No, I thought I'd say.
Oh, that's Jelle's question, right?
For the discussion.
Yeah.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah.
Yeah. So shall I repeat the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit up there.
It's if the I think if I remember correctly, if the wheels are necessarily deposits.
Yeah. And I think it's important to. It's always not just to ask that for wheels, but for many of the. I mean, we already mentioned the shoes as a good example. I think the assumption is often a bog is a ritual landscape, and therefore whatever we find in it is a votive deposit. I think that's a bit too easy. It's more nuanced, and we didn't have time in this particular session to go into that. But yeah, there is definitely finds that might be explained in a different way. For instance, we have a small arrowhead in our collection, which may also just have been lost during hunting, those kind of things. And it's true that not all wheels necessarily are deposits, but it's very likely for this particular category of find, because they're often not found, say, near a bog trackway, or they're found in pairs lying on top of each other. So there's clearly there's some thought about how to put these things into a bog, and often they are. This particular example, especially, I think, is quite new as well. So it almost looks like it was made and then put into the bog, so it wasn't even used, and that again kind of shows that it's probably a votive offering rather than the wheel that was lost when they entered the bog on trackway or a wagon dog.
Yeah.
And the peculiar thing about the trackways that we have in the Netherlands is that many of them just seem to stop somewhere in the bog as well. So they don't cross from the one sandy soil to the other sandy soil. They just cease to be, more or less. So they may, in some cases, go to iron ore deposits. That's a hypothesis that has been posted, but it's that certainly doesn't qualify for all of them. So,
no, and that's another, I think, another category where the argument has been made, oh, it must be a ritual procession way. But like you say, in some cases they seem to be to bog iron ore, and maybe I always think it's not. There's no use in actually saying, oh, it was a ritual thing, or oh, it was a practical thing. It could be both. Same goes for the shoes and the arrow. You know, someone may have hunted, had a successful hunt, lost one of his arrows, and left him as a present for the, you know, something like that. Like you can't really separate the two, the ritual and the factual.
It's a very modern day perspective.
Exactly.
To see, look at it back there.
Yeah. Can I ask a small question about this? I was wondering about the wheel still. Wouldn't it be too, let's say, precious to just lose it? Wouldn't you do everything to take it with you? I don't know, but maybe.
Yeah, and reuse it in some way.
Exactly. Yeah.
And in some cases, we also have finds of younger wheels, which are spoke wheels, from spaken, so in Dutch, which are composite wheels dating from Bronze Age and I think maybe Iron Age, and they are also found in smaller bogs. So not a place that would be crossed, but just a small depression where it was found together with other objects also, which were offered. So that's also, I think, an indication that something more is at play.
Yeah, and in some cases there are half finished products. Again, also sometimes it's smaller bogs. And again, the question rises: is that a votive offering, or is it possibly part of the production process of a wheel or a wooden bowl? Is it watering the wheel? Yeah, there are always questions to ask, I think.
Yeah. In 2 weeks' time, we also talk about the place meanings of bogs with the talk of Maurice Paulussen. Also looking at the perception of bogs in the past using different types of sources and methods. And I think that it's going to show, I do not want to give it much away yet, but it's going to show that the place meanings of bogs may change over time or even during the day.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Nice.
Does anyone want to comment on that from the audience?
Yeah, we have 3 questions, and we'll discuss those, and then we finish because of time.
Yeah.
So let's see the first question. Do you have them at hand, Emily?
Ingrid is here. Or Melanie, sorry.
Melanie, let's first go to Melanie. Yes, go ahead, Melanie.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to respond to that presence of wheels in the bogs, because it's something that we see in a lot of wetland sites, and I think Flag Fen, Must Farm, it might seem odd to have quite large wheels out in the bog, but of course some of the large trackways could take wheeled vehicles, and if you are extracting bog ore, then you need to carry it from the bog. But it puzzled me as to why these extraordinarily big and complex and often quite worn objects get placed in these contexts at the end of their lives. And I think we almost have to start the other way around. What do you do with such things at the end of their lives? Where is the appropriate place to put them? And I think bogs are one of the right places to end the life of something like this. And we mustn't forget the wheel is so much more than just holding together a vehicle. It is a solar symbol. It is conjuring the wheel of life, solar cycles. It's used in amulets during this time, and it is, if we look at the Trondheim sun chariot, it's the way in which the very cosmology, the way the world works might be brought around. So when something like that goes into the bog, there's obviously so much symbolism packed into it. So I think it's the right place for the right thing.
And I think that's like 2 things that struck me when you were talking. Is like, we've talked about these objects still in a kind of relatively passive way, but I think things like this wheel or that necklace with all the heirloom stones in it must have almost been perceived as a person in itself, right? With something with power, like I said, amuletic power. And I think the same is true for many of these wheels. And when you're saying that they are symbolic. I think that's very, very true, and that's why they in the late Neolithic, when they are introduced, and I think when people come into them, they deposit these things particularly because of all those symbols and all that symbolism behind it.
Thanks for that addition, Melanie. And so we have two more questions. One was from Ingrid. All right.
People with questions can also just speak up if they like.
Yeah.
If they feel comfortable with it.
I had no question, at least. I don't think so.
Sorry, I thought you had your hand raised before. Then there's a question from Aukin. Were religious sacrifice performed with the public? Accessibility would then be an important factor. So I don't know who of you would like to give a go at that.
That's a very good question, and has also been a matter of debate in Dutch archaeology, whether you would have people standing there and watching while you performed a specific ritual. I think the hypothesis has been posted that you would have different categories of depositional sites, so to say, and that some places some offerings would enable a larger crowd to be present. I can imagine something like that maybe for offerings in the Bhutan Moor, or something like the WUR Assistant temple where people could gather. But with either, I always had the impression that it's such a small depression that there isn't even place for hundreds of people to stand there. It doesn't even fit. So I could see that more on, well, not on a household level, but on the level of maybe slightly higher than that, just a number of communities together who would decide on that. And I think it could be different. And some of these elements that some of the funds that you showed could be more personal deposits, even, right?
Yeah, so I think, like you say, it's the context, the bog setting, so to speak, but it's also the category of find. So I can imagine those hair braids being deposited by one, maybe two people, whereas something like the Baja Osterveld temple will have involved many people, and the big stone thing, like just for practical reasons, already requires maybe a few people. But yeah, we don't unfortunately know much about what exactly went on. And there were a few drawings in my presentation of Tollenvan, and that, as you could see in the reconstruction drawings, involved the community, like you say.
Yeah,
it's very hard. We will probably never know for sure how many people were involved.
Yeah, thanks, Roy. So we have the last question that is from Jelle. And he says, isn't the ending of the bog trackway somewhere in the bog? Which is not the case for every bog trackway in the Boer-Tangamoor, by the way, as a result of lack of research or recording into the trajectory of most of the trackways? Or might it be related to the fact that some of the stretches of the bog did not need to be crossed by trackways because these stretches were easy to go by on foot?
Yeah, I think we do not have a single trackway for which we are sure that it crossed the entire Boer-Tangamoor. There's one which it has been hypothesized, and that's the Palter Bridge. And that's a very long one dating to the Iron Age, and that could be up to 12 kilometers long. So then it would be an enormous one. But there are some higher sandy soils in part of that bog, near Westerwolde, for example. But it isn't sufficient to cross the whole bog. You cannot cross that bog without getting wet feet or drying. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to thank you all for this enlightening presentations and discussion. And we close with for this part, and we invite you for the third Peat Exchange series, which is on the 10th of March. So hope to see you back then, and please register in time for that.